Vanity Fair special correspondent Brian Stelter and The Atlantic's staff writer David Frum. Hello to both of you. Great to have you back on the show. I appreciate you making the time. David, I'll start with you. Is there anything to read into the request coming from the jury from where you sit?
I'm sure there is, but I'm not going to be old enough to do it. There are people who make a solid living out of analyzing juries. I'm not one of those people. What I'm thinking about as I watch this trial is the American justice system has found it able to hold some kind of account to Donald Trump for all of the sleazy, squalid aspects of his life before and during the presidency. It's having a much tougher time holding him to account for his danger to the Constitution. It is sobering that Trump could go to the polls in November as a convicted felon for this part of his life, but that there will be no action at all, nor conclusion at all on the legal aspects of trying to overthrow the election of 2020 and seize power by violence and force.
I think from what I've read, and certainly polls, Brian, to what David's saying, that is potentially more politically consequential for Trump. Like a verdict on those allegations would appear to be more damning in the eyes of voters on both sides of the aisle than potentially what we are seeing go down here.
I think that's right. I think that's the consensus view among political elites in the United States. I was just talking to a senior Democratic lawmaker who says, I hope this verdict comes as soon as possible so we can move on and talk about the stakes of this election, right? So there's a desire even among some Democrats to get back to the key core campaign issues. But I say all that, I don't want to diminish what's about to happen, whether it is tomorrow or Friday, whenever this verdict comes. It is a unprecedented moment in American history and a statement, a ruling, an actual verdict about this former president. The assumption, of course, among many, I think including even among Trump, is that he's going to be found guilty. You played that soundbite a minute ago where he says even Mother Teresa couldn't survive this, couldn't get through this. So he is, of course, lowering expectations, assuming the worst. And based on that initial note from the jury, the jurors, they want to read more about the early testimony from David Pecker. And that has been a prosecution strategy to say, don't just take Michael Cohen's word for it. Look at these other witnesses. So there is an early indication from the jury they are actually doing what the prosecutors want and looking at other witnesses besides Cohen.
What is your sense, David, of the potential consequences for Trump of a guilty verdict?
I think here's a consequence that we all have to keep in mind. It gives us a foretaste of what a second Trump presidency would be like. His top priority, should he be returned to the presidency, is going to be smashing up all of these verdicts against him. This is a New York criminal case. There's a Georgia criminal case. There may possibly be an Arizona criminal case. There are 2 federal criminal cases. And of course, there's $500 million in civil damages. Now, he's going to have to find some way to overturn judgments in 3 different states, 2 different federal jurisdictions, plus $500 million in civil damages. And that's a formula for chaos. The president doesn't have the power to pardon himself, most people think, but it's never been tested. It's going to be tested. The president is going to try to govern the country with an attorney general who'd be stooge enough to help him overturn will such a person get through the Senate? What would that be like? Do we have a third Trump impeachment trial if he goes through with these things as president? The formula, I think what it points to is it's unending chaos, second Trump presidency, driven by his need to clear his record of the many criminal and civil cases against him.
If that's the prescription for what the presidency looks like in the interim, prior to the actual election, Brian, what is your sense of what kind of bearing a consequence to this trial, be it one way or the other, will have? Like, is that chaos translatable, I guess?
Yes. And I don't want to overstate the consequences, right? Because so many minds are made up. So many people's views are hardened when it comes to Trump. I was up in Toronto last weekend. There's nothing like a great weekend in your beautiful country to be reminded of how radical and weird the American politics are right now. I mean, this idea that we're having a rematch between Trump and Biden, the idea that most people don't want to see that rematch happen, but it's happening anyway. This is a very weird election. But Biden will be able to come out if Trump is found guilty and start to call him a convicted felon. And those sorts of messages do matter. They may at least matter among some voters, but I don't think we should overstate it. Most Americans aren't really tuning into this trial. They don't really care that much, even though it is a very important deal. It is a consequential moment. It's unprecedented. A lot of people are opting out of this story. So I think it's really unknowable how it could impact those next 5 to 6 months of a general election cycle. Biden can try to use this to his advantage, but he's not always proven to be the best messenger against Trump.
What's your sense, David, of the time? Sorry, do you want to jump in on that point?
I just want to add something. The basic grammar of this election from a Biden point of view is Biden is shedding votes on from the people who are least committed to the political process. Young people, poorer people. There's some indications that he's not doing as well among black men as he did last time. And those are all people with a lower likelihood to vote and who are not strongly connected to the Democratic Party as an institution. But where Biden has made gains, where he made his big gains in 2020, was among that 1/5 of the Republican Party that kept voting for Nikki Haley even after she dropped out. And we're not talking about millions and millions of people there. We're talking about just enough. And those are highly committed. Those are the people who go to the vote in school board elections, go to PTA meetings. They are highly committed. They do follow the news, and they don't love the Biden domestic record, but they don't want chaos, and they don't want the betrayal of Ukraine and the betrayal of Israel.
Let me just ask you to follow up on that. Are there enough of them to have an impact in the states that matter most? And by that, I mean those key swing states, which now we've seen, I think, a succession of 3 polls show Trump has not a massive lead, but a lead over Biden in the majority of them.
When everyone says swing states, they mean the upper Midwest, the industrial Midwest.
Correct.
But the map is changing. Georgia is a swing state. Arizona is a swing state. Nevada is a swing state. Colorado is a swing state. North Carolina is a swing state. And the politics of those states may be different. Biden is actually is doing a bunch of protectionist moves, which are pretty rubbish policy, in order to strengthen himself there. But if you look at the Atlanta suburbs, the Charlotte, North Carolina suburbs, the Phoenix suburbs, and say, who are the swing voters in those areas, in those states that are maybe part of a very different map in 2024, I think they may respond to a message of order and stability and normality as opposed to chaos.
What are your thoughts on that, Brian?
There's, that idea of who are less, what voters are low information voters who are mostly tapped out, who are less likely to vote versus those who are much more engaged. That is where this battle is going to be. Can you encourage people who right now are on the sidelines, who might not want to care at all about the election? Can you engage them and convince them to care? Biden probably can't, Trump probably can't, but surrogates can. Other politicians can. Celebrities might be able to. Those are definitely some of the tests in these swing states going forward. And as David said, the map has broadened. The definition of a swing state is different than it has been in the past. There's also, of course, the third-party X factor of RFK Jr. and how relevant he will be. Right now it's all about this trial, but less than a month from now there will be that debate, apparently, between Biden and Trump, unless one of them backs out. So a month from now, he may be a convicted felon, the former president, and he may be on a debate stage arguing why he should be back in office. That is just how upside down this is.
I agree with Brian that Biden can't make. I agree with Brian that Biden can't make people care, but Trump has proven he is very able to make people care by making them care against him.
Right. Okay. Well, I got to leave it on that note. Thank you very much, both of you, for your analysis this evening. I appreciate it. As always, David Frum and Brian.